Before dawn on the 19th of May, 1536, a queen walked toward a scaffold inside the Tower of London. Anne Boleyn wore a gray damask gown trimmed with fur. Her face was composed. Her steps were measured. Around her stood soldiers, officials, witnesses, and men who knew that the slightest sign of sympathy could be dangerous. She had once been the most powerful woman in England. A king had broken with Rome for her. A kingdom had been divided for her. Monasteries would fall, laws would change, and blood would be spilled in the struggle that followed her rise. Now the king was nowhere to be seen, and spoke briefly. She did not accuse Henry. She did not plead for rescue. She praised him as a gentle and sovereign lord, because even at the edge of death, words could endanger those she loved. Then she knelt. The executioner had been brought from Calais. He carried a sword instead of the usual axe. According to later accounts, he distracted her for a moment, called for the weapon, and struck before she realized the blow was coming. In one instant, the woman Henry VIII had pursued for years was gone, and the king was already preparing to marry again. That is the image history remembers: a powerful monarch, 6 wives, 2 executed queens, and a crown that seemed to consume everyone who came close to it. But Henry VIII was not born a monster. He began as the dazzling young prince of a new dynasty. He was educated, athletic, musical, devout, and admired across Europe. He wanted to be remembered as a warrior king, a scholar, a loyal husband, and a defender of the Christian faith. Instead, he became the ruler who broke England from papal authority, destroyed the monasteries, executed ministers and friends, and left his children to inherit a divided kingdom. The question is not simply why Henry married 6 times. The deeper question is how a celebrated prince became a king feared by nearly everyone around him. To understand that transformation, we must return to a time when the Tudor crown itself was still fragile. Henry was born on the 28th of June, 1491, at Greenwich Palace, on the banks of the River Thames. He was the second son of King Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. His father had won the throne only 6 years earlier at the Battle of Bosworth Field. Henry VII had defeated Richard III, ended the main phase of the Wars of the Roses, and founded the Tudor dynasty. But victory did not create security. The new king faced rebellions, rival claimants, foreign threats, and old noble families whose loyalties could change with the wind. The memory of civil war remained fresh. England had seen kings deposed, princes disappear, and armies decide who wore the crown. Henry VII therefore ruled cautiously. He watched the nobility closely. He guarded money carefully. He arranged marriages as instruments of survival. His eldest son, Arthur, was the future of the dynasty. The younger Henry was not. As a second son, Henry was expected to serve the crown in another way. He was given an excellent education, possibly with a future church career in mind. He studied Latin, French, theology, music, poetry, and classical literature. He learned to hunt, ride, wrestle, dance, and handle weapons. He grew tall and powerful. In youth, he was over 6 feet in height, unusually imposing for the period. Foreign ambassadors described him as handsome, energetic, and confident. He enjoyed performance and competition. He composed music, wrote verses, played instruments, and loved being watched. From the beginning, Henry understood that kingship was theater. A ruler did not merely command. He had to be seen commanding. He had to appear stronger, richer, wiser, and more magnificent than every other man in the room. Yet while the young Henry learned the arts of power, the crown belonged to his older brother. Arthur, Prince of Wales, was married in 1501 to Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. Her parents had united much of Spain and completed the conquest of Granada. The marriage linked the young Tudor dynasty to one of Europe's greatest royal houses. The celebrations were magnificent, but only months later, Arthur became ill at Ludlow Castle. In April 1502, he died. He was 15 years old. The future of the Tudor dynasty changed overnight. The younger Henry, still only 10, became heir to the throne, and Catherine of Aragon became a young widow trapped between 2 kingdoms. The political solution seemed obvious. Catherine could marry Henry, preserving the alliance with Spain and avoiding the return of her dowry. But there was a religious obstacle. Church law prohibited a man from marrying his brother's widow. Catherine insisted that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated. A papal dispensation was obtained, allowing the new match to proceed. Even then, the marriage was delayed for years. Money, diplomacy, and suspicion stood in the way. Henry VII negotiated relentlessly over Catherine's dowry. At one point, the young Prince Henry was made to formally reject the agreement, perhaps to preserve his father's freedom of action. Catherine remained in England, often short of money and uncertain of her future. Then, in April 1509, Henry VII died. The 17-year-old prince became King Henry VIII. One of his first decisions was to marry Catherine. The wedding took place in June. Days later, they were crowned together at Westminster Abbey. To many observers, it seemed like the beginning of a golden age. Henry was everything his father had not been. He was young, open-handed, glamorous, and eager for glory. Where Henry VII had been cautious, his son was bold. Where the old king had been associated with financial restraint, the new king spent lavishly on tournaments, clothing, jewels, banquets, palaces, ships, and war. The people welcomed him. The courts celebrated him. European diplomats watched him closely. Here was a king determined to prove that England mattered. But the first blood of the new reign came quickly. Two of Henry VII's most hated financial officials, Edmund Dudley and Richard Empson, were arrested and executed. They had enforced the old king's harsh financial policies. Their deaths were popular, and they helped the young monarch distance himself from his father's reputation. It was an early lesson in Tudor politics. A ruler could calm public anger by sacrificing servants who had carried out royal policy. Henry would use that lesson again. At first, however, his reign was filled with promise. Catherine of Aragon was intelligent, dignified, and politically experienced. She had endured years of uncertainty without losing her sense of royal duty. She and Henry appeared affectionate. He trusted her enough to leave her as regent when he campaigned in France. The marriage also seemed fertile at first. Catherine became pregnant several times. But one child after another died. A daughter was stillborn. A son, named Henry, lived for only a few weeks. Other pregnancies ended in loss. In 1516, Catherine gave birth to a surviving daughter, Mary. Henry loved the child, but she was not the son he believed his dynasty needed. At that moment, the disappointment did not yet destroy the marriage. There was still time. Or so Henry thought. The young king's greatest dream was military glory. He admired warrior monarchs and medieval heroes. He wanted victories in France, where English kings had claimed the crown for generations. In 1513, Henry crossed the Channel with an army. The campaign produced the Battle of the Spurs, a minor engagement later celebrated as a triumph. The English captured the towns of Therouanne and Tournai. The victories were not strategically decisive, but they gave Henry what he wanted: pageantry, conquest, and the image of a warrior king. While he was in France, a more serious danger appeared in the north. James IV of Scotland invaded England with a large army, honoring Scotland's alliance with France. Catherine of Aragon helped organize the defense as regent. At Flodden Field, English forces under the Earl of Surrey defeated the Scots in one of the bloodiest battles in British history. James IV was killed. So were many of Scotland's leading nobles. Catherine sent Henry a piece of the dead king's blood-stained coat as proof of the victory. The year 1513 seemed to confirm that England's young monarch had been chosen for greatness. But victories were expensive. War consumed money. Palaces consumed money. Tournaments consumed money. Henry's generosity created loyalty, but it also created dependence on officials who could find revenue. The most important of those officials was Thomas Wolsey. Wolsey was not born into the great aristocracy. He was the son of an Ipswich tradesman, probably a butcher or cattle dealer. Through intelligence, ambition, and extraordinary administrative skill, he rose through the church and entered royal service. Henry liked men who could make difficult problems disappear. Wolsey became indispensable. By 1515, he was Lord Chancellor and a cardinal. Eventually, he also became papal legate, giving him immense authority within the English church. For more than a decade, Wolsey stood just below the king. He managed diplomacy, finance, justice, church affairs, and royal ceremony. He built Hampton Court Palace on a scale that rivaled royal residences. He traveled with a household so magnificent that some nobles resented him. Yet Wolsey's power was always borrowed. It came entirely from Henry. and borrowed power could vanish in a single day. During the 1510s and 1520s, Europe was dominated by three young rulers: Henry VIII of England, Francis I of France, and Charles V, ruler of Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. Each wanted prestige. Each feared the others. Each used alliances, marriages, and war to reshape the balance of power. Henry imagined himself as the equal, and perhaps the judge, of the two great continental monarchs. In 1520, Henry met Francis I near Calais at an event later known as the Field of the Cloth of Gold. For more than 2 weeks, the two courts competed in splendor. Temporary palaces rose from the fields. Fountains reportedly ran with wine. Nobles wore cloth of gold, jewels, silk, and velvet. There were tournaments, feasts, masses, dances, and displays of wealth so extravagant that they became legendary. Henry and Francis embraced as brothers. Then they competed as rivals. During an informal wrestling match, Francis threw Henry to the ground. It was a small moment, but one Henry was unlikely to forget. The festival promised friendship, yet within 2 years England and France were at war again. This was the pattern of Henry's foreign policy. Grand promises, costly campaigns, shifting alliances, moments of spectacle that rarely produced lasting gain. At home, the king remained deeply religious. This is one of the great contradictions of his life. Henry VIII did not begin as an enemy of the Catholic Church. He attended Mass, revered traditional ceremonies, went on pilgrimage, founded religious institutions, and studied theology. In 1521, he published a defense of the 7 sacraments against Martin Luther. Pope Leo X rewarded him with the title Fidei Defensor, Defender of the Faith. Henry took pride in it. Yet within little more than a decade, the same king would reject papal authority over England. The change did not begin with doctrine. It began with fear. By the middle of the 1520s, Catherine of Aragon was approaching 40. Her pregnancies had ended. The only surviving child of the marriage was Princess Mary. England had seen female claimants before, but never an undisputed ruling queen. Henry believed a daughter might invite civil war, foreign interference, or rival claims. The memory of the Wars of the Roses haunted the Tudor dynasty. To Henry, the lack of a son was not merely a private sorrow. It was a threat to the kingdom and proof that something was wrong. He began to focus on a passage from the book of Leviticus. If a man married his brother's wife, the union would be childless. Henry was not literally childless. He had Mary. He also had an acknowledged illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, born to his mistress Elizabeth Blunt. But he had no legitimate male heir. He convinced himself that his marriage to Catherine offended divine law. The papal dispensation that had allowed the marriage, he argued, could not override Scripture. There was also another force at work, Anne Boleyn, and came from an ambitious court family. She had spent part of her youth in the Netherlands and France, where she learned courtly manners, fashion, music, and the subtle arts of conversation. She was not considered the most conventionally beautiful woman at court, but she was magnetic. She was witty, self-possessed, stylish, and difficult to control. Her sister, Mary Boleyn, had probably been one of Henry's mistresses, and refused to follow the same path. When Henry pursued her, she would not simply become another temporary favorite. She demanded marriage. Whether this was calculated ambition, personal conviction, or a refusal to accept the vulnerability of being a royal mistress, the effect was explosive. Henry became obsessed. His surviving letters reveal longing, frustration, jealousy, and dependence. He sent gifts. He imagined a future with her. He promised that she would become his wife. But Catherine was still queen, and Catherine would not disappear quietly. Henry turned to Wolsey. The cardinal was ordered to secure an annulment. Under normal circumstances, papal courts might have found a legal path. Royal marriages were often dissolved when politics required it. But these were not normal circumstances. Catherine was the aunt of Charles V, the most powerful ruler in Europe. In 1527, imperial troops sacked Rome. Pope Clement VII became, in effect, a prisoner of Charles. To grant Henry's annulment would humiliate the emperor. To refuse Henry would risk England's loyalty. The Pope delayed. Henry raged. Wolsey searched for a solution. A legatine court finally opened at Blackfriars in London in 1529. Catherine appeared before Henry and made a dramatic appeal. She knelt before him. She reminded him that she had been his true and obedient wife for 20 years. She insisted that she had come to him a virgin. She asked what offense she had committed to deserve rejection. Then she refused the authority of the court and appealed directly to Rome. Her dignity impressed many who witnessed it. The proceedings collapsed. The Pope recalled the case. Wolsey had failed, and failure before Henry VIII was becoming dangerous. The cardinal was stripped of office. He surrendered the Great Seal. Hampton Court passed to the king. Wolsey withdrew to York, but he was later arrested on charges of treason. While traveling south to face Henry, he fell ill and died at Leicester Abbey in 1530. He is said to have reflected that if he had served God as diligently as he had served the king, God would not have abandoned him in his old age. Whether the words were recorded exactly or shaped by later memory, they captured the tragedy of serving Henry. Wolsey had been the most powerful man in England after the king. Then the king needed someone to blame. But Wolsey's fall did not solve the marriage crisis. It created a vacuum. Into that vacuum stepped men with far more radical ideas. One was Thomas Cranmer, a scholar and priest who suggested that Henry's marriage could be judged by universities and theologians rather than the papal court. Another was Thomas Cromwell, a lawyer and former servant of Wolsey who possessed a rare understanding of parliament, finance, and royal power. Cromwell saw that the king's problem could not be solved by asking Rome more politely. It could be solved only by changing the source of authority itself. The struggle over one marriage was about to become a revolution. The revolution did not arrive in a single proclamation. It advanced through statutes, appointments, threats, sermons, and carefully chosen words. Henry still considered himself a Catholic king. He did not intend to become a follower of Martin Luther. He wanted the ancient faith without the Pope's power to deny him. That distinction would shape everything that followed. Cromwell began using Parliament to dismantle the legal foundations of papal authority in England. The clergy were accused of recognizing foreign jurisdiction. Under enormous pressure, they paid a vast fine and acknowledged Henry as supreme head of the Church in England, though the phrase was softened with the words, "as far as the law of Christ allows." The qualification would not last. Payments to Rome were restricted. Appeals to papal courts were forbidden. England was declared an empire, complete within itself, governed by one supreme head, the king. The language was legal. The consequences were revolutionary. For centuries, English Christians had belonged to a Western church that recognized the Pope's authority. Now the king's marriage required the nation to claim that no foreign bishop had jurisdiction over England. Meanwhile, Anne Boleyn's position became increasingly urgent. Henry had spent years promising marriage, and had spent years waiting. By late 1532, she was treated almost like a queen. She traveled with Henry to Calais, where they met Francis I. Soon afterward, Henry and Anne were secretly married, probably in January 1533, and was already pregnant. Thomas Cranmer had become Archbishop of Canterbury. In May, he convened a court that declared Henry's marriage to Catherine invalid. Days later, he confirmed the marriage to Anne, and was crowned at Westminster Abbey in June. The ceremony was magnificent, but the crowds were not entirely friendly. Catherine remained popular. Many people regarded Anne as an intruder and the king's actions as a betrayal of a faithful wife. Henry did not care. He expected a son. Astrologers, physicians, and courtiers spoke confidently of a prince. On the 7th of September, 1533, Anne gave birth. The child was a girl. She was named Elizabeth. The announcement documents had to be altered. The word prince was changed to princess. Henry concealed his disappointment, but the pressure on Anne began immediately. She had achieved what seemed impossible. She had become queen. She had helped transform the government of England. Yet her survival now depended on doing what Catherine had failed to do. She had to produce a living son. The break with Rome accelerated. In 1534, Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, declaring Henry the only supreme head on earth of the Church of England. The Treasons Act made it dangerous to deny the king's title in words or writing. Loyalty was no longer enough. Silence could be interpreted as resistance. Two of the most famous victims were John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, and Sir Thomas More. More had served as Lord Chancellor after Wolsey. He was a celebrated scholar, lawyer, and author, admired across Europe. He had once been close to Henry. He opposed Protestant heresy and had defended the traditional church with severity. But he could not accept the king's supremacy over the church. More tried to remain silent. He resigned office. He avoided public confrontation. Yet silence denied Henry the public approval he wanted. More was imprisoned in the Tower. In 1535, Fisher and More were executed. More reportedly declared that he died the king's good servant, but God's first. The executions shocked Europe. Henry had killed men not for raising armies, but for refusing to accept his authority over conscience. This was a turning point. The young king who had once gathered humanist scholars around him was becoming a ruler who demanded agreement, not merely obedience. At the center of government, Thomas Cromwell grew more powerful. He was unlike the great nobles who inherited influence. Born the son of a blacksmith and brewer in Putney, Cromwell had traveled abroad, worked as a merchant and soldier, studied law, and mastered the machinery of administration. He understood records, committees, taxation, and parliament. He also understood Henry. The king wanted control. Cromwell would build the system that gave it to him. The royal supremacy required more than legislation. It had to be enforced in every parish, monastery, and household. Clergy were ordered to acknowledge the king's title. Preachers defended royal authority. Oaths tested loyalty. Printed texts spread official arguments. Cromwell became the king's vicegerent in spiritual matters, exercising powers no lay minister had held before. Then he turned toward the monasteries. England's monasteries and convents were religious communities, landowners, schools, hospitals, employers, and centers of charity. Some were wealthy. Others were poor. Some were disciplined. Others had reputations for decline or mismanagement. Cromwell ordered visitations that recorded alleged corruption, sexual misconduct, superstition, and financial abuse. The reports were used to justify suppression. In 1536, smaller monasteries were dissolved. Their lands and wealth passed to the crown. For years later, almost every monastery, priory, and convent in England and Wales had been closed. Shrines were destroyed. Relics were seized. Libraries were scattered. Roofs were stripped for lead. Bells were melted down. Monastic lands were sold or granted to nobles and gentlemen. The scale was enormous. For the crown, it was a transfer of wealth. For reformers, it was an attack on corruption and superstition. For many ordinary people, it was the destruction of institutions woven into local life. The king received a fortune, but much of it was spent on war, palaces, and patronage. The land passed into private hands, helping create a new class of property owners with a direct interest in defending the religious settlement. The monasteries could never simply be restored without threatening those who had profited from their fall. Cromwell had made the break with Rome difficult to reverse. But even as Henry's power expanded, his marriage to Anne Boleyn began to collapse. Anne was intelligent and politically engaged. She supported evangelical reformers, promoted the English Bible, and took interest in appointments and patronage. She could also be sharp-tongued and confrontational. At a court built around the king's ego, those qualities created enemies. Her greatest problem, however, was biological and political. She suffered miscarriages. One pregnancy ended in 1534. Another, in January 1536, ended with the loss of a male fetus, according to later reports. The timing was devastating. Only weeks earlier, Catherine of Aragon had died at Kimbolton Castle. Catherine had spent her final years separated from her daughter Mary, refusing to accept the title of Dowager Princess of Wales. She continued to call herself Queen. In her last letter to Henry, if the traditional version is authentic, she forgave him and asked him to care for Mary. Her death removed one obstacle. Anne's miscarriage created another. Henry reportedly told her that he saw clearly God would not give him male children through her. He had once interpreted Catherine's failed pregnancies as divine judgment. Now he used the same logic against Anne. And there was already another woman at court. Jane Seymour came from a respectable gentry family. She had served Catherine and then Anne. Unlike Anne, she presented an image of quiet obedience. Her motto would be, bound to obey and serve. Henry began sending her gifts. Jane refused to become his mistress. The pattern was familiar. But this time, the king did not need 7 years to remove a wife. Thomas Cromwell organized the case against Anne with terrifying speed. In the spring of 1536, several men were arrested, including the musician Mark Smeaton, Sir Henry Norris, Sir Francis Weston, William Brereton, and Anne's brother, George Boleyn. They were accused of committing adultery with the queen, and was also accused of incest with her brother and of plotting the king's death. The charges were sensational. They were also deeply doubtful. Some alleged encounters were said to have happened when and was elsewhere, or when she was pregnant. The case appears to have been constructed from court gossip, hostile interpretation, and political necessity. Smeaton confessed, possibly under pressure or torture, though the exact circumstances remain uncertain. The other men denied the accusations, and was arrested and taken by barge to the Tower of London. She entered through the same fortress where she had stayed before her coronation. Then, she had been preparing to become queen. Now, she was preparing to die? Inside the tower, and moved between panic, prayer, laughter, and disbelief. Her words were reported to Cromwell by the women assigned to watch her. She asked how the king could believe such accusations. She wondered whether she would be sent to a convent. She spoke of her small neck. The men accused with her were tried and condemned. George Boleyn defended himself skillfully, but the verdict had been decided before he entered the hall, and was tried before a court of peers presided over by her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk. She denied every charge. She was found guilty. Her marriage to Henry was annulled shortly before her death, creating the strange legal contradiction that she was condemned for adultery within a marriage the crown declared invalid. On the 17th of May, the accused men were executed on Tower Hill. 2 days later, and faced the swordsman. The speed of her destruction sent a message throughout England. A queen could be crowned, celebrated, obeyed, and erased in less than 3 years. Henry married Jane Seymour 11 days after Anne's execution. The court changed around the new queen. Anne's symbols disappeared. Jane's family rose. Princess Mary, after years of pressure, finally submitted to her father's authority and accepted that her parents' marriage had been invalid and that Henry was head of the church. The submission was painful and humiliating, but it restored her to the king's favor. Jane helped encourage the reconciliation. Then, in 1537, Jane became pregnant. England waited. On the 12th of October, after a long and difficult labor, she gave birth to a son. He was named Edward. The king had what he had wanted for nearly 3 decades, a legitimate male heir. Celebrations spread across the kingdom. Bells rang. Bonfires burned. A grand christening was held at Hampton Court. But Jane was gravely ill. 12 days after giving birth, she died, probably from complications following childbirth. Henry mourned her deeply. Of his 6 wives, Jane alone gave him the son he desired. She was later buried beside him at Windsor. In Henry's memory, she became the perfect queen, but her death did not bring peace. Even before Edward's birth, the religious revolution had provoked rebellion. In the autumn of 1536, unrest began in Lincolnshire and spread into northern England. Tens of thousands joined what became known as the Pilgrimage of Grace. The rebels carried banners showing the wounds of Christ. They demanded an end to religious changes, the restoration of monasteries, the removal of unpopular advisors, and redress for economic grievances. This was not a small riot. It was the greatest internal threat of Henry's reign. The royal army was not strong enough to crush the movement immediately. The Duke of Norfolk negotiated. Promises were made. A parliament in the north was discussed. The rebels dispersed, trusting the king's mercy. Then smaller disturbances gave Henry the excuse he needed. The leaders were arrested. Robert Aske, one of the most prominent, was taken to York and executed in chains. Lord Darcy and others were killed. Abbots, connected to resistance, were hanged. Villages and families learned what royal forgiveness could mean. Henry believed rebellion was not merely political disobedience. It was an attack on the sacred order of kingship. His response was calculated terror. The North was subdued, but the memory of betrayal remained. By the late 1530s, Henry stood at the height of his authority. The Pope had been rejected. The monasteries were falling. Opponents had been executed. A prince had been born. Yet the king remained vulnerable in one crucial way. Edward was an only son. If the child died, the succession crisis would return. Henry needed another marriage. This time, the choice would be shaped by international danger. France and the Holy Roman Empire appeared to be moving toward peace, raising fears that Catholic powers might unite against England. Cromwell favored an alliance with German Protestant princes. A marriage could secure it. The chosen bride was Anne of Cleves, sister of Duke William of Cleves. Henry had not met her. The painter Hans Holbein the Younger was sent to produce her portrait. Holbein's image showed a composed young woman in elaborate clothing, facing the viewer directly. Henry approved. The marriage negotiations advanced. Then, Anne arrived in England. On New Year's Day, 1540, Henry went to Rochester in disguise, expecting a romantic encounter drawn from courtly tradition. He entered Anne's chamber and embraced her. She did not recognize him. The moment was a disaster. Henry felt rejected and embarrassed. He complained that he did not like her. Later stories claimed he called her a Flanders mare, but that phrase is not securely contemporary and may be a later invention. What is certain is that Henry wanted out. Cromwell could not easily undo the alliance he had created. The marriage went forward on the 6th of January. Henry claimed he could not consummate it. Anne's attendants found her innocent and inexperienced. She reportedly believed that affectionate kisses might be enough to cause pregnancy. Within 6 months, the marriage was annulled, and agreed that a previous marriage contract and non-consummation made the union invalid. She did not resist. She did not appeal to foreign powers. She accepted a generous settlement, including houses, lands, and status as the king's beloved sister. Her cooperation saved her. Anne of Cleves outlived Henry and every one of his other wives. Cromwell was not so fortunate. His enemies at court moved against him. The Duke of Norfolk and conservative nobles resented his rise and his religious policies. Henry blamed him for the failed marriage. Cromwell was arrested during a meeting of the Royal Council in June 1540. He was accused of treason and heresy. No full public trial allowed him to defend himself. He wrote desperate letters to the king, ending one with the plea, "Most gracious prince, I cry for mercy, mercy, mercy." Henry did not answer with mercy. Cromwell was executed on the 28th of July. The execution was reportedly badly performed. On the same day, Henry married his 5th wife. Her name was Catherine Howard. She was young, lively, and related to the powerful Duke of Norfolk. She had served as a maid of honor to and of Cleves. Henry was approaching 50. His body was failing. His leg caused constant pain. He had grown extremely heavy. Yet Catherine's youth made him feel restored. He called her his rose without a thorn. But the court had chosen a bride whose past it did not fully understand. And the truth, when it emerged, would destroy her. Catherine Howard had grown up in the household of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. It was a great aristocratic residence, but supervision was loose. Young women slept together in shared chambers. Men entered after dark. Courtship, gossip, music, and secrecy flourished beyond the control of older guardians. Before she met Henry, Catherine had relationships with at least 2 men. The first was her music teacher, Henry Mannix. The second was Francis Derham, a secretary in the Duchess's household. The relationship with Derham appears to have been serious enough that they called each other husband and wife. Under the customs of the time, a binding pre-contract could make a later marriage invalid. When Catherine entered royal service, that past was hidden. At first, her marriage to Henry seemed happy. The king showered her with jewels, gowns, and estates. He took her on progress through the north in 1541, partly to display royal power in a region once shaken by rebellion. Catherine danced. Henry watched her. The aging king appeared convinced that youth had returned to his court. But Catherine's former companions knew too much. Derham obtained a position in her household. Another courtier, Thomas Culpeper, began meeting her secretly. The exact nature of their relationship remains disputed. Surviving evidence shows dangerous intimacy, hidden meetings, and messages arranged by Lady Rochford, the widow of Anne Boleyn's brother. Whether Catherine and Culpeper committed adultery cannot be proved with absolute certainty. For Henry, secrecy was enough. In late 1541, Archbishop Cranmer received information about Catherine's earlier relationships. He feared telling the king directly. Instead, he left a written account where Henry would find it during worship. At first, Henry refused to believe the accusation. He ordered an investigation, perhaps expecting Catherine's innocence to be confirmed. Instead, witnesses spoke. Derham confessed to the earlier relationship. Culpeper's meetings were uncovered. A letter from Catherine to Culpeper revealed longing and dependence. Henry's reaction was explosive. He had presented Catherine as pure. He had treated her youth as proof of his own vitality. Now he felt mocked before the court and betrayed in the most personal way. Catherine was confined at Hampton Court. According to later tradition, she escaped her guards and ran toward the chapel, screaming for Henry, only to be dragged away before reaching him. The story is dramatic, but its historical foundation is uncertain. What is certain is that she never saw the king again. Dereham and Culpeper were executed in December 1541. Culpeper, as a gentleman, was beheaded. Dereham suffered the harsher death reserved for traitors. Catherine was not given an ordinary trial. Parliament passed an act making it treason for a woman with an unchaste past to marry the king without revealing it. The law reached backward to condemn conduct that had not been treason when it occurred. On the 13th of February, 1542, Catherine Howard was executed at the Tower. Lady Rochford died beside her. Catherine may have been in her late teens or early 20s. The popular story that she declared she would rather die the wife of Culpeper than Queen of England is almost certainly a later invention. Contemporary reports describe a frightened young woman who made a conventional confession, asked for forgiveness, and faced death with difficulty. Henry did not attend. Once again, a queen had vanished behind the walls of the Tower. But Henry himself was no longer the golden prince who had married Catherine of Aragon more than 30 years earlier. His transformation was visible to everyone. In youth, he had been lean, athletic, and restless. He hunted for hours, played tennis, wrestled, rode hard, and competed in tournaments. He could exhaust courtiers younger than himself. By the 1540s, movement had become painful. The most famous turning point came in January 1536, when Henry was thrown from a horse during a joust and reportedly lay unconscious for around 2 hours. The accident terrified the court. Anne Boleyn was pregnant at the time and miscarried soon afterward. It is tempting to explain Henry's later cruelty entirely through this injury. Some modern theories have suggested brain trauma, hormonal disorders, diabetes, or other medical conditions. The evidence is too limited for confident diagnosis. What can be said is that Henry suffered repeated leg problems, including chronic ulcers that became infected and refused to heal. Earlier injuries from riding and jousting may have contributed. The wounds could be agonizing. They leaked. They smelled. They sometimes prevented him from walking. Pain narrowed his world. Exercise became difficult. His weight increased dramatically. Armor made for him in the 1540s suggests a waist far larger than in youth. Special machinery may have been used to lift him onto a horse. Rooms and routes were adapted to reduce walking. The king who had built his identity around physical mastery was becoming trapped inside his own body. He did not respond by accepting weakness. He demanded that the court pretend weakness did not exist. Servants dressed him in magnificent fabrics. Portraits showed him broad, solid, and immovable, feet planted apart, hands gripping gloves or staff. The most famous image, designed by Hans Holbein for Whitehall Palace, presented Henry not as a tired man, but as overwhelming royal force. The original mural was later destroyed by fire, but copies preserved its message. Henry stared directly outward. He needed no crown. His body itself had become a symbol of the state. Yet behind the image was fear. Fear of illness. Fear of rebellion. Fear of foreign invasion. Fear that the son for whom he had overturned a kingdom might die. Fear that those closest to him were laughing when he could not hear. The older Henry became, the more dangerous suspicion became. This did not mean he acted without calculation. He remained capable of charm, patience, theological argument, and administrative attention. He could reward servants generously. He could enjoy music, architecture, gardens, ships, books, and conversation. But affection no longer offered safety. Thomas Wolsey had served him for years. Thomas More had been his friend. And Boleyn had been his obsession. Thomas Cromwell had engineered his revolution. All fell when they no longer served the king's immediate needs. The pattern affected everyone at court. Men learned to read his face before speaking. A pause could be dangerous. A joke could be remembered. A rumor could become evidence. A royal question might have only one safe answer. The court of Henry VIII was magnificent because magnificence was political. It was also tense because proximity to power could bring both fortune and death. Every morning, the king's private chambers became a stage of controlled access. The right to help dress him, bring water, arrange clothing, or speak during private moments could be more valuable than an official title. Those closest to his body could influence his attention. The privy chamber therefore became a battleground. Young gentlemen competed for intimacy. Great families tried to place relatives near the king. Factions formed around religion, marriage, and patronage. Information moved through servants, ladies, secretaries, physicians, priests, and musicians. A whispered remark in one room might reach Henry by evening. The king encouraged competition because it prevented any single group from becoming secure. Yet he also depended on the very factions he distrusted. He could not rule alone. He needed ministers to draft laws, judges to enforce them, sheriffs to maintain order, bishops to preach obedience, and nobles to command local loyalty. The image of absolute monarchy concealed a daily reality of negotiation. Henry was powerful, but England was not a modern centralized state. Orders traveled by horse. News arrived late. Local officials had personal interests. Enforcement varied from county to county. The king's answer was to make examples. Punishment did not have to reach everyone if it frightened everyone. Public executions, displayed heads, confiscated lands, and acts of attainder made royal anger visible. A person condemned by attainder could be declared guilty by Parliament without a normal trial. Property returned to the crown. Families lost inheritance. Political defeat became economic destruction. This was not invented by Henry, but he used it repeatedly. The machinery of government also became more specialized during his reign. The enormous transfers of monastic property required new financial courts. The Court of Augmentations managed former church lands. Other bodies handled wards, first fruits, tenths, and royal revenue. The king's household and the state were slowly becoming more distinct, though the process was incomplete. Parliament also gained importance. Henry did not create parliamentary government in a modern sense. He dominated Parliament through influence, management, and royal authority. But because the break with Rome was enacted through statute, Parliament became the instrument that declared the crown supreme and reshaped national religion. This created a lasting constitutional paradox. The king appeared more powerful than ever, yet his greatest changes were given legal form through Parliament. Future generations would remember both sides of that legacy. Religion remained the most dangerous issue. Henry had rejected the Pope, but he did not accept the full Protestant program. He opposed the authority of Rome while continuing to believe in many traditional doctrines. He defended the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. He supported clerical hierarchy. He could approve an English Bible and then punish people for reading it in ways he disliked. The result was a church pulled in opposite directions. Reformers hoped the royal supremacy would open England to evangelical teaching. Conservatives hoped the king would preserve traditional worship without Rome. Henry shifted between them. In 1536, the 10 Articles introduced limited reform while retaining much Catholic doctrine. In 1537, the bishop's book explained belief in terms that satisfied neither side completely. In 1539, the Act of 6 Articles reaffirmed traditional teachings, including transubstantiation, clerical celibacy, and private masses. The act became known by some Protestants as the whip with 6 strings. Those who denied its doctrines could face severe punishment. The contradiction was deadly. Protestants could be burned for heresy. Catholics could be hanged or beheaded for treason if they rejected royal supremacy. On some days, prisoners with opposing beliefs were taken toward execution together. Henry's church was not defined by tolerance. It was defined by obedience to Henry. One of the clearest examples came in 1540, when 3 Protestant preachers were burned at Smithfield, while 3 Catholic priests were executed for denying the supremacy. The message was deliberate. The king stood between extremes, but the space between them was whatever he decided it was. The English Bible became another symbol of contradiction. William Tyndale had translated much of the New Testament and Old Testament into English with extraordinary skill. His work was condemned. Copies were smuggled into England and publicly burned. Tyndale himself was executed near Brussels in 1536, reportedly praying that the King of England's eyes would be opened. Yet only a few years later, an authorized English Bible appeared in churches. The Great Bible of 1539 drew heavily on Tyndale's translation. Copies were chained in parish churches so they could be read aloud. Crowds gathered to hear scripture in their own language. For many people, this was revolutionary. Words once mediated through Latin worship and clerical explanation could now be heard directly. But Henry grew alarmed by argument and unauthorized interpretation. Access was later restricted. Certain lower-status people and many women were forbidden to read scripture privately under legislation passed in 1543, though the exact rules were complex. The book was opened. Then the king tried to control how far the opening would spread. Even the destruction of monasteries had contradictory effects. Some former monastic churches became parish churches or cathedrals. Some schools and charitable institutions survived under new foundations. Much land was sold to finance royal needs. But communities also lost hospitals, alms, hospitality, employment, and places of burial. Pilgrimage shrines that had drawn generations of worshippers were dismantled. The shrine of Thomas Becket at Canterbury was destroyed in 1538. Becket had been murdered in 1170 after conflict with King Henry II. His cult represented the possibility that church authority could stand against a king. For Henry VIII, that memory was intolerable. Becket was declared a traitor. His name was removed from service books. His shrine's gold, jewels, and offerings were seized. A saint who had challenged royal power was condemned more than 3 centuries after his death. The past itself was being placed on trial. Across England, landscapes changed. Abbey bells stopped ringing. Roofless cloisters opened to rain. Stone was carried away to build houses, walls, and barns. Families purchased lands once owned by monks. Parish churches removed some images and preserved others, depending on local pressure and changing orders. The Reformation was not experienced as one clean event. It arrived in waves. A new prayer, a missing shrine, a royal coat of arms placed where the Pope's name had once been honored. A familiar monk suddenly turned out of his home. A Bible chained to a lectern. A neighbor questioned for words spoken after drinking. For ordinary people, national revolution entered through the village church. While religion divided the kingdom, Henry invested heavily in war and defense. He loved ships. The Navy became one of the most important long-term achievements of his reign. Earlier English kings had assembled fleets when needed, often relying on merchant vessels. Henry expanded royal dockyards, built ships, improved administration, and strengthened coastal defenses. Among the most famous vessels was the Mary Rose, probably named in honor of the Virgin Mary and perhaps Henry's sister Mary. Launched early in his reign, she was rebuilt and enlarged over time. The ship represented royal power, technological ambition, and the growing importance of artillery at sea. But in July 1545, during a French attack near Portsmouth, the Mary Rose sank. Henry watched from shore. The exact cause remains debated. She may have heeled during a turn, allowing water to enter through open gun ports. Overloading, wind, design changes, and crew actions may all have contributed. Hundreds died. The king who had built the ship could do nothing as it disappeared. The wreck would remain beneath the Solent for centuries, preserving weapons, tools, clothing, and human remains that later revealed the lives of Tudor sailors with extraordinary detail. Henry's military spending also transformed the coastline. After relations with France and the Empire worsened, a chain of artillery forts was constructed along southern England. Castles at Deal, Walmer, and other locations were designed for cannon warfare. The money came partly from the wealth of the dissolved monasteries. Ancient religious property became modern fortification. War consumed nearly everything Henry gained. His campaigns were driven by dynastic ambition, personal honor, and a medieval claim to France that had little chance of full realization. He wanted to stand beside Charles V and Francis I as a conquering monarch. But England's resources were smaller. The king could win a town. He could not dominate Europe. And every attempt brought the kingdom closer to financial exhaustion. After Catherine Howard's execution, Henry waited more than a year before marrying again. His 6th wife was Catherine Parr. She was about 30 years old, twice widowed, educated, composed, and experienced in managing households. She had loved another man, Thomas Seymour, brother of the late Queen Jane. But when the king chose her, refusal was almost impossible. Catherine married Henry in July 1543. She did not arrive at court as a sheltered girl. She understood danger. She also understood the royal family. Catherine worked to reconcile Henry with his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. The 2 princesses had been declared illegitimate after the annulments of their mothers' marriages, but both retained loyal supporters and powerful symbolic importance. Under Catherine Parr's influence, they returned more fully to court life. In 1544, Parliament passed the Third Succession Act. It placed Mary and Elizabeth after Edward in the line of succession, though it did not restore their legitimacy. The arrangement was strange but practical. Henry's only legitimate son came first. Then came two daughters whom the law still treated as illegitimate, yet who might one day wear the crown. That possibility would become reality sooner than anyone imagined. Catherine Parr was more than a peacemaker. She was an intellectual figure with strong reformist interests. She read theology, sponsored scholars, and published devotional works under her own name. Her prayers or meditations appeared in 1545, making her one of the first English women to publish an original work in print under her own name. She also served as regent when Henry campaigned in France in 1544. In that role, she managed council business, finances, and preparations for defense. Like Catherine of Aragon 3 decades earlier, she demonstrated that a queen could govern while the king pursued war abroad. But learning and competence did not protect her completely. Conservative figures at court distrusted her religious sympathies. Bishop Stephen Gardiner and Lord Chancellor Thomas Wriothesley were associated with efforts to investigate reformers around the queen. In 1546, the Protestant writer and Askew was arrested, tortured, and burned for heresy. Officials wanted evidence linking her to women in Catherine Parr's household. Askew refused to provide it. Her torture on the rack was illegal because she was a gentlewoman, yet it continued. According to her own account, the Lord Chancellor and another official operated the rack themselves when the lieutenant of the tower refused. She had to be carried to execution in a chair because she could no longer walk. Her death showed how close religious conflict had come to the Queen's chambers. A warrant was reportedly prepared for Catherine Parr's arrest. Catherine learned of the danger. She went to Henry and presented her theological discussions not as instruction, but as the humble effort of a wife seeking comfort from her husband's superior wisdom. The performance worked. When guards arrived the next day, Henry dismissed them angrily. Catherine survived because she knew when to turn intelligence into submission. She was the only one of Henry's wives to outlive him while still married to him. But survival at court did not mean safety beyond it. The final years of Henry's reign were dominated by war. In 1542, conflict with Scotland intensified. The Scottish king, James V, was the son of Henry's sister Margaret Tudor. That family connection did not prevent rivalry. Scottish forces suffered defeat at Solway Moss in November 1542. James V died weeks later, leaving an infant daughter, Mary, Queen of Scots. Henry saw an opportunity. He proposed a marriage between the infant Mary and his son Edward. If successful, the union might bind Scotland and England under Tudor influence. The Treaty of Greenwich in 1543 appeared to arrange the match. But Scottish politics turned against it. Fear of English domination, religious divisions, and the traditional alliance with France undermined the agreement. Henry responded with force. The campaign later became known as the Rough Wooing. The name sounds almost playful. The reality was brutal. English armies burned Edinburgh, destroyed towns, attacked abbeys, and devastated the countryside in an attempt to compel a marriage alliance. The violence strengthened resistance rather than breaking it. The infant Mary was eventually sent to France and betrothed to the French heir. Henry's attempt to secure Scotland through marriage helped drive Scotland closer to France. At the same time, Henry launched his last great invasion of France. He allied once more with Emperor Charles V. The plan called for coordinated attacks toward Paris. Henry crossed the Channel in 1544 with a huge army. He was no longer the young horseman of 1513. Transporting and housing the king required elaborate arrangements. Yet he remained determined to command in person. Instead of moving rapidly toward Paris, Henry concentrated on the siege of Boulogne. The town fell in September. It was the kind of victory Henry loved. Visible, defensible, and easy to celebrate. But Charles V made a separate peace with France, leaving England exposed. Holding Boulogne became enormously expensive. The French threatened invasion. War spread across land and sea. In 1545, a French fleet entered the Solent. It was during this confrontation that the Mary Rose sank before Henry's eyes. French forces landed briefly on the Isle of Wight, but achieved little. England survived the invasion threat. The war ended with the Treaty of Ardres in 1546. Henry retained Boulogne temporarily, with France agreeing to buy it back after several years. The king claimed victory. The treasury told another story. War had pushed the government toward desperate finance. The crown sold monastic lands at reduced prices. It borrowed heavily. It debased the coinage by reducing the amount of precious metal in silver coins. The policy raised short-term revenue, but contributed to inflation and distrust. As the thin layer of silver wore away from some coins, the copper beneath became visible, especially around the raised nose of Henry's portrait. The aging king acquired a mocking nickname, Old Copper Nose. Few would have dared say it near him. For ordinary people, the financial consequences of Henry's reign were felt in rising prices and uncertainty. Population growth, poor harvests, land use changes, taxation, and currency debasement all played roles. Wages often failed to keep pace with costs. The grandeur of court existed beside hardship in villages and towns. A royal banquet might display peacocks, venison, sugar sculptures, imported wine, spices, and silver plate. A laboring family might worry about the price of bread. The Tudor world was intensely unequal. Ranks shaped clothing, diet, education, legal influence, and even the way one was expected to speak. Sumptuary laws attempted to regulate who could wear certain fabrics, colors, and furs. Clothing announced position. A nobleman's velvet sleeve was not merely fashion. It was a public statement of hierarchy. Henry understood this perfectly. His wardrobe was vast. Records list gowns, doublets, caps, jewels, chains, feathers, embroidery, and cloth of gold. He used gifts of clothing and jewelry to reward favor. He also used architecture. During his reign, the royal palace system expanded dramatically. Henry acquired or developed Hampton Court, Whitehall, St. James's, Nonsuch, and other residences. Palaces allowed the court to move, display power, hunt, escape disease, and consume supplies without exhausting one location. Whitehall became the largest royal palace in Europe, a maze of chambers, galleries, courtyards, gardens, recreational spaces, and service buildings. Nonsuch Palace, begun in 1538, was intended to rival anything in France. Its name declared its purpose. There was no such palace anywhere else. The exterior was covered in elaborate Renaissance decoration. Classical figures, biblical scenes, and royal symbols proclaimed Henry's culture and supremacy. The building did not survive, but descriptions suggest an extraordinary monument to competitive kingship. Hampton Court, originally built by Wolsey, became one of Henry's favorite palaces after the Cardinal's fall. Its kitchens were designed to feed hundreds of courtiers and servants. Fires burned constantly. Meat turned on spits. Ale flowed in enormous quantities. Bread, fish, herbs, pastry, and spices moved through a network of storerooms and passages. A Tudor palace was not quiet. It rang with bells, boots, dogs, carts, chopping blocks, music, prayer, argument, and rumor. The smell of smoke mixed with roast meat, damp wool, rushes, wax, horses, perfume, sewage, and river water. The king moved through this world behind layers of access. Public rooms allowed nobles and ambassadors to observe him. Private chambers restricted entry. The most intimate rooms were accessible only to trusted servants. Even privacy was political. When Henry ate in public, the meal became ceremony. Dishes were tasted to guard against poison. Servants moved according to rank. Kneeling, bowing, and washing hands followed ritual. Food displayed power because abundance was power. Henry's reputation for gluttony is strongest in his later years, but royal eating was always ceremonial and substantial. He ate meat, poultry, fish, bread, fruit, sweets, and rich sauces. Medical ideas of the time linked diet to bodily humors, so physicians advised foods according to season and condition. Medicine could offer little for chronic ulcers, infection, or the deeper effects of inactivity. Doctors examined urine, checked pulse, prescribed herbs, bleeding, purges, poultices, and dietary changes. The king's body was treated according to learned theories inherited from antiquity. The result was rarely lasting relief. Pain made Henry impatient. His attendants had to clean and dress wounds whose condition could worsen suddenly. When the ulcers closed, pressure and fever may have increased. When they reopened, drainage brought relief, but also risk of infection. No one could tell the king that the body of the sovereign was failing. So court life continued. Music remained important to him. Henry employed singers, composers, and instrumentalists from England and abroad. He played keyboard instruments and the lute. Some compositions attributed to him survive, including Pastime with Good Company, though not every piece linked to his name was necessarily written by him. The song's celebration of hunting, singing, dancing, and princely recreation reflects the spirit of his youth. By old age, the words must have carried the sound of another life. Henry also collected books and took theology seriously. He annotated texts. He argued with bishops. He did not see himself as a ruler who merely used religion for political convenience. He believed he possessed the authority and understanding to define religious truth for his subjects. That certainty made compromise difficult. To disagree with Henry was not simply to challenge policy. It was to challenge the king's image of himself as God's chosen governor. The same certainty shaped his treatment of Ireland. English authority in Ireland had long been uneven, strongest around the Pale near Dublin, and dependent on alliances with local lords. Many Anglo-Irish families lived with customs that English officials viewed with suspicion. Gaelic chiefs governed large territories beyond direct royal control. In 1534, a rebellion led by Thomas Fitzgerald, known as Silken Thomas, challenged the crown. It was suppressed with severity. Henry's government then pursued a more ambitious policy of expansion and centralization. In 1541, the Irish Parliament declared Henry King of Ireland. Earlier English monarchs had used the title Lord of Ireland under papal authority. By taking the crown of Ireland directly, Henry asserted sovereignty independent of Rome. The policy known as surrender and regrant encouraged Irish chiefs to submit their lands to Henry and receive them back under English titles. In theory, it offered inclusion within the Tudor political order. In practice, cultural difference, religious change, land disputes, and military pressure ensured continuing conflict. The title of King of Ireland outlived Henry. So did the instability his policies helped deepen. Wales was also drawn more tightly into the English state. The Laws and Wales Acts of 1536 and 1543 integrated Wales into the English legal and administrative system, created counties, and gave representation in Parliament. The legislation ended many separate Welsh legal customs and required English in official life, disadvantaging Welsh speakers. To Henry's government, this was order and unity. To later generations, it could also appear as absorption and cultural domination. The Tudor state was becoming larger, more centralized, and more demanding. It asked not only for taxes and military service, but for uniformity of law, language, loyalty, and religion. Yet Henry's own household remained divided by the fate of his children. Mary, born in 1516, had once been treated as a princess of unquestioned legitimacy. She received an excellent education and was proposed as a bride for European princes. Then her mother fell from favor, her title was stripped away, and she was forbidden to see Catherine. Officials pressured her to acknowledge that her parents' marriage had been unlawful. Mary resisted for years. Her resistance placed servants and supporters in danger. After Anne Boleyn's death, Mary finally submitted. She wrote statements accepting her father as supreme head of the church and herself as illegitimate. The emotional cost must have been immense. She survived by surrendering the public truth her mother had defended until death. Elizabeth, born in 1533, experienced a different fall. At birth, she was heir presumptive and the center of a new court. Before her third birthday, her mother was executed and her legitimacy erased. Her household reportedly struggled even to obtain suitable clothing for the child after Anne's fall. Yet Elizabeth received a brilliant education. Tutors taught her languages, rhetoric, philosophy, theology, and classical texts. She grew into a careful observer, skilled at controlling expression and delaying commitment. Her father's court taught her the danger of marriage, faction, and careless words. Edward, born in 1537, was the precious center of the dynasty. Henry guarded his health anxiously. The prince had his own household, tutors, and elaborate ceremonies. He was intelligent, serious, and increasingly influenced by Protestant teaching. The three children rarely formed a simple family. They lived in separate households. Their mothers had different faiths. Their legal status shifted with royal policy. Their religious futures moved in opposing directions. Yet all three would become monarchs. Henry spent his reign searching for a secure succession. Instead, he created three rival religious inheritances that would struggle over England after his death. By 1546, the question of who would control the young Edward had become more important than almost any official debate. Henry was clearly declining. No one knew how much time remained. The prince was only 9 years old. If he inherited the crown as a child, England would be governed through a council or protectorate. Whoever controlled that government could shape religion, distribute lands, command patronage, and decide the fate of enemies. Two broad factions competed near the king. The conservative group included the Duke of Norfolk, his son Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, Bishop Gardiner, and Lord Chancellor Wriothesley. They favored traditional doctrine and distrusted radical reform. The reformist group included Edward Seymour, uncle of Prince Edward, John Dudley, and allies around Catherine Parr. The divisions were not simple. Personal ambition overlapped with belief. Men could support reform in one area and resist it in another. Family rivalry mattered as much as theology. Henry watched them compete. Then he turned on the Howards. The Duke of Norfolk came from one of England's oldest and greatest noble families. His son Surrey was a gifted poet, soldier, and proud aristocrat. Surrey had introduced important forms into English poetry and helped develop the English sonnet. He also possessed a dangerous sense of lineage. In late 1546, Surrey was accused of improperly displaying royal arms, suggesting a claim to the throne. Heraldry was not decoration alone. It announced blood, inheritance, and political possibility. Surrey denied treason, but the king's suspicion had already hardened. Surrey was executed in January 1547. Norfolk was condemned by Act of Attainder and expected to die next. Then Henry himself died before the execution could take place. The old duke survived by hours. It was one final example of the strange power of time at Henry's court. A sunrise could separate the condemned from the living. The king's last illness unfolded behind guarded doors. By December 1546, he was severely unwell. His legs were ulcerated. His movement was limited. He may have suffered kidney and circulatory problems, infection, and the effects of extreme obesity, though exact diagnosis is impossible. Counselors continued to bring documents. Decisions still carried the force of law. The machinery of monarchy could not acknowledge that its center was dying. Speaking openly of the king's death could itself be considered treasonous. This created a terrible silence. Those around Henry saw what was happening, yet they had to behave as if the future remained distant. Catherine Parr was no longer constantly beside him. The couple had experienced tension, and the court's factions surrounded access to the royal chamber. Prince Edward remained away from the center of infection and intrigue. At last, Archbishop Cranmer was summoned. By the time he arrived, Henry may no longer have been able to speak. Cranmer asked the king to give some sign that he trusted in God. According to the traditional account, Henry squeezed his hand. Shortly after midnight on the 28th of January, 1547, Henry VIII died at Whitehall Palace. He was 55 years old. For hours, the death was not publicly announced. Meals continued to be carried toward the royal apartments. Officials needed time to secure Edward and control the transition. The king's body remained at the center of a performance designed to conceal the fact that the king no longer existed. When the news finally spread, England entered a new reign. Henry's body was prepared for burial and carried toward Windsor. He was interred in St. George's Chapel beside Jane Seymour, the wife who had given him Edward. He had planned a magnificent tomb. It was never completed. The king who spent his life constructing an image of permanence rests beneath a comparatively simple slab. A monument intended to overwhelm future generations remained unfinished, just like the religious and political settlement he left behind. His will created a regency council for Edward VI, but power quickly concentrated around Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, the prince's uncle. Under Edward, England moved more clearly toward Protestant reform. Images were removed from churches. Chantries were dissolved. Worship changed. The Book of Common Prayer appeared in English. Clerical marriage was accepted. These reforms went further than Henry had allowed. The father had broken from Rome while defending many Catholic doctrines. The son's government began transforming belief and worship themselves. Resistance followed. In 1549, rebellions erupted. including the Prayer Book Rebellion in the Southwest, where many demanded the restoration of traditional religion. In Norfolk, Kett's rebellion reflected economic and social grievances. The young king's reign revealed how unstable Henry's revolution remained. Edward VI died in 1553 at the age of 15. His advisors attempted to prevent the Catholic Mary from inheriting by placing Lady Jane Grey on the throne. The plan collapsed within days. Mary gathered support and entered London as queen. The daughter Henry had humiliated became the first woman to rule England in her own right with broadly recognized authority. Mary restored papal relations and Catholic worship. She married Philip of Spain. Protestant opponents were burned, creating the reputation that later generations would capture in the name Bloody Mary. Her policies were shaped by conviction, dynastic need, and the wounds of her past. She had watched reformers displace her mother, declare her illegitimate, and demand that she deny the church in which she had been raised. Mary's reign cannot be reduced to revenge, but Henry's treatment of her formed part of the world she carried onto the throne. Mary died childless in 1558. Elizabeth succeeded her. The daughter of Anne Boleyn became Queen of England. Elizabeth restored royal supremacy and established a Protestant settlement designed to command outward conformity while avoiding some extremes. Her reign would be remembered for the defeat of the Spanish Armada, religious tension, exploration, literature, and the creation of a powerful royal image. She never married. The child whose mother died because she failed to give Henry a son ruled for more than 44 years. The dynasty survived not through the male heir Henry had sacrificed so much to obtain, but through the daughter of the woman he executed. That is the great irony at the heart of Henry VIII's story. He believed only a son could secure England. Yet Edward died young. Mary ruled. Elizabeth ruled. And the Tudor dynasty ended childless after all three of his surviving legitimate children had worn the crown. Henry's search for permanence produced continuous change. His search for unity produced religious division. His search for a son placed two queens on the throne. His search for glory left debts and unfinished wars. His search for absolute obedience strengthened Parliament's role in national transformation. To understand his legacy, however, it is necessary to move beyond the familiar list of wives. Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, and of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr were not simply characters in a royal romance. Each stood at the intersection of diplomacy, religion, gender, law, and succession. Catherine of Aragon was the daughter of monarchs who had reshaped Spain. She served as ambassador, queen, regent, and mother. Her refusal to accept annulment was not merely emotional stubbornness. She believed her marriage was valid before God. Her daughter's legitimacy depended on it, and surrender would destroy both truth and honor. And Boleyn was not simply the temptress of hostile legend. She spent years resisting the role of royal mistress. She supported reformist networks, influenced patronage, and understood the political meaning of queenship. Her fall came not because the charges against her were proven, but because Henry wanted freedom and Cromwell could provide it. Jane Seymour is often remembered only as the quiet wife who gave birth to Edward. Yet her family's rise transformed politics, and her image of obedience offered a deliberate contrast to Anne. Her death allowed Henry to idealize her without facing the ordinary tensions of a long marriage. Anne of Cleves has often been reduced to the supposedly unattractive bride rejected at first sight. The evidence is more complicated. Henry's humiliation at their first meeting, diplomatic shifts, and his own anxiety about consummation all mattered, and responded with intelligence. By accepting annulment, she gained security, wealth, and a respected place in England. Catherine Howard has often been portrayed either as a reckless adulteress or a helpless child. The surviving evidence does not fit neatly into either story. She was young and placed in a marriage with a powerful, aging king. She concealed a past that could have invalidated the union. Her secret meetings with Culpeper were dangerous, but the full nature of their relationship remains uncertain. She was destroyed by a system in which the king's wounded honor became treason. Catherine Parr is remembered as the wife who survived, but survival required political skill. She served as regent, published books, encouraged education, helped restore the royal children, and navigated a near-fatal conflict over religion. The familiar rhyme turns 6 complex lives into 6 simple outcomes. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. It is memorable. It is also incomplete. Catherine of Aragon was not technically divorced in the modern sense. The marriage was annulled. And Boleyn's marriage was also annulled before her execution. Jane's death came after childbirth. And of Cleves lived as the king's sister. Catherine Howard's condemnation depended on law shaped to fit her case. Catherine Parr survived Henry but died the following year after giving birth to her only child. The rhyme remembers what happened to them. It forgets who they were. Henry's own image has been simplified in a similar way. Popular memory often combines 2 different men. Handsome, musical, athletic, dressed in gold, admired by scholars, eager to win tournaments and wars. Enormous, wounded, suspicious, surrounded by terrified courtiers and doomed wives. Both are real. The difficult question is how one became the other. There was no single moment. The transformation accumulated. The death of his brother made him heir. The losses of Catherine's children intensified his fear of dynastic failure. Military ambition trained him to measure kingship through victory and display. Wolsey's success taught him that ministers existed to deliver his desires. Wolsey's failure taught him they could be discarded. The struggle for annulment convinced him that law and church must bend around royal necessity. The break with Rome surrounded him with arguments that his authority came directly from God. The execution of respected opponents weakened the limits of conscience. The dissolution of monasteries placed wealth and patronage in his hands. Rebellion deepened his suspicion. And Boleyn's fall showed how accusation could solve a marriage. Jane Seymour's death turned the male heir into something sacred. Physical pain narrowed his patience. Faction taught him that everyone near the throne wanted something. Age made every threat feel immediate. By the final decade, Henry had spent years watching people agree with him because disagreement was dangerous. A ruler who hears only agreement eventually loses the ability to distinguish loyalty from fear. That may be one of the darkest lessons of his reign. Henry was not irrational in every decision. Many of his actions responded to real problems: an uncertain succession, foreign pressure, uneven government, clerical abuses, and the need for defense. His ministers developed effective administrative tools. His reign saw major growth in royal naval capacity, legal integration, print culture, education, and state formation. But the methods mattered. He made personal desire a question of national loyalty. He used law to remove those who blocked him. He demanded public acceptance of claims that changed according to his needs. He turned uncertainty into treason. The result was a monarchy that appeared stronger while becoming increasingly dependent on violence and fear. Historians still debate how much responsibility belongs to Henry and how much to his ministers. Thomas Cromwell designed much of the legislative revolution. Cranmer provided religious and legal arguments. Parliament passed statutes. Local officials enforced them. Noble factions supplied accusations and witnesses. But Henry chose the direction. He approved the punishments. He rewarded success and destroyed failure. His servants operated inside a system built around his will. When policies became unpopular, the minister could be blamed. Wolsey fell for failing to secure the annulment. Cromwell fell after the Cleves marriage. The king remained above responsibility. This protected the crown in the short term. It also made service to the crown terrifying. The number of executions under Henry is difficult to establish precisely. Later claims sometimes run into tens of thousands, but exact totals are uncertain and often exaggerated. What is beyond dispute is that his reign used execution extensively against rebels, religious opponents, alleged traitors, monks, nobles, ministers, and 2 queens. The spectacle mattered as much as the number. A noble beheaded on Tower Hill. A priest hanged for denying supremacy. A reformer burned for rejecting doctrine. A rebel displayed in chains. Each death communicated the boundaries of royal permission. Yet fear never created complete agreement. Traditional belief survived in households and regions. Reformist ideas spread through books and preaching. People conformed publicly while thinking privately. Some welcomed the closure of monasteries. Others hid relics. Some bought church lands. Others remembered the charity once offered there. The English Reformation was not simply imposed from above or demanded from below. It emerged through pressure, opportunity, belief, greed, fear, and adaptation. Henry began it for reasons tied to marriage and authority. The consequences escaped his control. Imagine England on the morning Henry became king in 1509. The bells of monasteries marked the hours. Pilgrims traveled to shrines carrying hopes, illnesses, grief, and offerings. The Pope's name belonged naturally within the structure of the Church. Latin filled the Mass. A son of the Tudor dynasty had married a Spanish princess, and most people expected their children to continue the line. The old king's careful treasury seemed ready to support a brilliant new reign. Now imagine the same kingdom in January 1547. The monasteries were gone. The Pope's authority had been declared foreign. The king stood at the head of the Church. Former abbey lands belonged to courtiers, merchants, lawyers, and local gentlemen. English Bibles had entered parish churches. Religious words could bring interrogation or death depending on how the king defined orthodoxy that year. Catherine of Aragon was dead in isolation. Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard had been executed. Wolsey, More, Fisher, Cromwell, Surrey, and countless lesser figures had fallen. The treasury was burdened by war. The coinage had been debased. A 9-year-old boy was about to inherit a religious revolution he had not created. No English ruler before Henry had transformed so many structures in so little time. Yet much of daily life still looked familiar. Farmers rose before sunrise. Markets opened. Craftsmen trained apprentices. Women managed homes, shops, farms, and estates, though law and custom limited their formal power. Children carried water, watched animals, gathered fuel, and learned work early. Roads turned to mud and rain. Winter nights were long. Fire was precious. Disease could arrive without explanation. Most people never saw the king, but they felt him through taxation, worship, law, rumor, and the faces of local officials reading proclamations. A royal command might reach a village as a paper nailed to a church door. The words had traveled from council chamber to secretary, from secretary to printer or clerk, from London to county, from county to parish. Then a priest or official read them aloud to people who could not read for themselves. This was how royal will became local reality. The expansion of print helped make it possible. Printing had reached England before Henry's reign, but the 16th century saw its political power grow. Books, proclamations, religious arguments, translations, and polemics circulated more widely. The crown licensed presses and attempted censorship. Reformers used print to spread ideas. Conservatives used it to defend tradition. Smugglers carried forbidden books through ports and merchant networks. A theology debated in Wittenberg or Zurich could enter London hidden in a bale of cloth. A royal response could then be printed and sent across the realm. Control of words became part of control of the kingdom. Henry understood the importance of language. The official case for the break with Rome presented England as a sovereign empire. The phrase did not mean an overseas empire in the later British sense. It meant a political body complete in itself, subject to no foreign jurisdiction. That claim outlived the marriage crisis that produced it. It contributed to a powerful tradition of national sovereignty, one that later generations would interpret in very different ways. The king's title also expanded. He became supreme head of the Church of England and King of Ireland. Wales was incorporated more closely into English administration. The crown's reach became more ambitious. But ambition did not guarantee control. In the north, memories of the pilgrimage of grace remained bitter. In Ireland, Tudor authority remained contested. Along the Scottish border, raiding and warfare continued. In coastal towns, fear of invasion shaped defenses. England was more centralized on paper than in practice. That gap between command and reality encouraged harsher enforcement. Noble power changed as well. The Wars of the Roses had weakened some ancient families, and Henry VII had restricted over mighty subjects. Henry VIII continued to depend on nobles while promoting men of lower birth whose authority came directly from royal service. Wolsey and Cromwell were the most dramatic examples. Their careers showed that talent could produce extraordinary ascent. Their deaths showed that ascent had no secure foundation. At the same time, the sale of monastic lands enriched a broad range of buyers. Nobles expanded estates. Gentlemen increased local influence. Lawyers and merchants entered the landed elite. These owners would resist any future attempt to return property to the church. A religious revolution became attached to title deeds, rents, inheritance, and family ambition. Belief could change. Property was harder to surrender. The crown's appetite for money also affected its relationship with Parliament. Henry summoned Parliament repeatedly during the Reformation era because statutes gave legitimacy and reach to his changes. Members did not operate with modern democratic independence, but debate, local interests, and legal procedures still mattered. Once Parliament had been used to define the succession, supremacy, doctrine, treason, and royal authority, it had participated in reshaping the Constitution. Later monarchs could not easily pretend that legislation had played no role. Henry strengthened monarchy. He also helped strengthen the idea that fundamental national changes could be made through statute. That unintended legacy would become important in the conflicts of the 17th century. The Royal Navy offers another contrast between immediate cost and long-term consequence. Henry spent extravagantly on ships, dockyards, guns, crews, and fortifications. Some projects were inefficient. Some vessels were flawed. The Mary Rose sank in sight of the king. Yet the permanent infrastructure of naval power became more substantial. Dockyards at Deptford, Woolwich, and Portsmouth supported shipbuilding and maintenance. Administrative offices developed. Specialized warships carried heavy cannon. England was still far from the global naval empire of later centuries. But foundations were being laid. The same king who looked backward toward medieval conquest also invested in technologies that pointed toward a different future. His armor tells a similar story. Henry loved the tournament, a ritual descended from aristocratic warfare. His early armor was made for speed, display, and competition. Later suits were built for a much larger body and for ceremonial power. One remarkable suit was intended for the field of the cloth of gold, but had to be altered when tournament rules changed. Its articulated metal covered nearly the entire body with astonishing craftsmanship. The object captures the world Henry wanted to inhabit: controlled danger, shining surfaces, perfect movement, and public admiration. But real war was changing. Gunpowder weapons, artillery forts, professional infantry, and naval cannon mattered more than chivalric display. Henry dreamed in the language of knights while spending money on the machinery of modern war. Art also served his reign. Hans Holbein's portraits recorded courtiers with extraordinary precision. Faces appear calm, fabrics exact, jewels heavy with meaning. The paintings seem to reveal individuals, yet they also construct status. Holbein painted Thomas More before his fall, Thomas Cromwell at the height of power, and of Cleves before her marriage, and Henry in the pose that became inseparable from his name. Seen together, the portraits resemble a silent court. Some subjects survived. Some were executed. Some helped destroy one another. The paint remains after the alliances vanished. Henry's own portrait became one of the most successful acts of royal propaganda in European history. Even people who know little about the Tudor period recognize the broad figure, square shoulders, jeweled clothing, and direct stare. The image is so powerful that it can hide the living man beneath it. It hides the 17-year-old who inherited a fragile crown. It hides the husband who once rode in matching clothes with Catherine of Aragon. It hides the father grieving dead infants. It hides the lover writing impatient letters to Anne Boleyn. It hides the injured body behind the widened stance. It hides fear inside certainty. The portrait does what Henry wanted. It makes him look permanent. His buildings attempted the same thing, but many disappeared. Whitehall Palace burned in the 17th century. None such was dismantled. Monastic treasures were melted or scattered. Tombs remained unfinished. Ships sank. Dynasties ended. The most durable monument was not stone. It was institutional change. The Church of England survived, though it changed greatly after Henry. The Crown's relationship with Parliament evolved. Ireland remained tied to English monarchy. Former monastic landownership reshaped society. The succession crises of Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth grew directly from his marriages and legislation. Henry did not plan all these outcomes. Powerful rulers rarely control the full meaning of what they begin. The king also left a transformed memory of monarchy itself. Medieval English kings had executed rivals and fought the church. Henry was not the first ruler to use terror, claim divine authority, or seek annulment. But the combination of print, portraiture, parliamentary statute, religious revolution, and intimate court drama made his reign unusually visible. His marriages turned private chambers into matters of state. A pregnancy could alter diplomacy. A miscarriage could destroy a faction. A lady's conversation could become evidence of treason. A king's desire could change worship across a nation. This is why the story remains so compelling. It is not only about 6 marriages. It is about what happens when the emotional needs of one person become inseparable from the machinery of government. Henry's fear of dying without a son was understandable in a dynasty born from civil war. But fear joined with unlimited authority becomes dangerous. Each solution created a larger problem. The annulment required pressure on the church. Papal resistance required legal independence. Legal independence required oaths. Oaths created martyrs. Royal supremacy opened the path to monastic dissolution. Dissolution provoked rebellion. Rebellion encouraged repression. The failure of Anne Boleyn to produce a son encouraged accusation and execution. The success of Jane Seymour produced an heir, but her death required another marriage. The Cleves alliance destroyed Cromwell. The Howard marriage ended on the scaffold. The final marriage brought reformers near the Queen and conservatives near the warrant for her arrest. Nothing remained contained. By the end, the king's original problem had been solved. Edward existed, but the kingdom was less settled than before. This does not mean Henry's reign was only destruction. Courts of law became more organized. Administrative record-keeping expanded. Naval infrastructure grew. Renaissance learning flourished. Music, architecture, scholarship, and printing developed. Wales gained parliamentary representation. English political identity changed. History rarely offers a reign made of pure darkness or pure progress. The same act can centralize government and suppress culture. The same religious change can open scripture to ordinary people and close monasteries that fed the poor. The same king can sponsor art and kill artists' patrons. The same parliament can give legal form to national independence and legal form to judicial murder. Henry VIII forces us to hold contradictions together. He was educated but not consistently wise. Religious but capable of reshaping religion around his authority. Courageous in display but deeply afraid of failure. Generous to favorites and merciless when favor ended. A builder who destroyed. A husband who demanded loyalty while repeatedly abandoning wives. A father whose obsession with succession traumatized all 3 children who survived him. A king who wanted to be remembered as England's greatest prince, but whose name became inseparable from the scaffold. There is another way to measure Henry's reign. Not by dates, not by wives, not by acts of parliament, but by places. Greenwich, where a second son was born without expectation of the crown. Westminster, where a radiant young couple were crowned beneath prayers for a fertile dynasty. Flodden, where thousands died while Catherine governed in Henry's absence. The Golden Fields near Calais, where 2 kings attempted to outshine each other. Blackfriars, where Catherine of Aragon knelt before her husband and refused to surrender her marriage. The Tower, where Anne Boleyn entered first as a queen and later as a prisoner. The Northern Roads, where pilgrims of rebellion marched beneath the wounds of Christ. The silent abbeys, their roofs open to the weather. Rochester, where Anne of Cleves failed to recognize a disguised king. Hampton Court, where Catherine Howard danced and Catherine Parr nearly faced arrest. Portsmouth, where the Mary Rose vanished below the water. Whitehall, where servants carried meals toward the room of a dead monarch because the kingdom was not yet ready to admit he was gone. Each place preserves a different Henry. At Greenwich, he was a child growing in the shadow of Arthur. He could not know that his brother's death would make every lesson urgent. A second son might serve the church or hold an important title. An heir had to become the future of the realm. The change would have affected every part of his upbringing. His household, education, public appearances, and security became matters of state. He was no longer simply Henry, Duke of York. He was the container of Tudor survival. This helps explain the intensity of his later fear. A dynasty was not an abstract institution to him. He had watched his father protect it from claimants and conspiracies. He knew that kings could fall. He knew that legitimacy could be challenged. He knew his own family had won the crown in battle. When he looked at Princess Mary, he may have seen a beloved child. He also saw a question mark. Could a woman command noble armies? Would a foreign husband rule through her? Would rival families revive old claims? The future offered no certainty. But Henry made the mistake of believing certainty could be forced into existence. At Westminster in 1509, none of this was visible. The young king and Catherine were crowned in a ceremony filled with sacred symbolism. Anointing set the monarch apart. Oaths bound him to justice and church. Music, incense, cloth, and procession announced harmony between heaven, crown, and people. Henry would spend the rest of his life expanding the sacred claims of that kingship. When the Pope obstructed him, Henry did not become less certain that monarchy was holy. He became more certain that the king answered directly to God. That belief placed enormous weight on his own judgment. If the king was God's appointed head, resistance could be interpreted as rebellion against divine order. The gap between political disagreement and spiritual crime narrowed. At Flodden, Catherine of Aragon showed what Henry later denied in practice, that a woman could exercise royal authority effectively. As regent, she helped oversee defense while pregnant. The English victory destroyed much of Scotland's political leadership. Her role became part of her identity as queen. Years later, Henry treated the absence of a son as proof that the marriage itself was cursed. But the same wife he rejected had once protected his kingdom while he pursued honor abroad. History's cruelty often lies in such reversals. A strength admired in one decade becomes inconvenient in the next. At the Field of the Cloth of Gold, Henry's hunger for recognition reached perfect expression. The meeting was diplomacy performed as spectacle. The temporary palaces were meant to look permanent. Gold fabric turned fields into royal theater. Even meals and fountains became weapons in a competition of prestige. Yet the peace did not last. The structures were dismantled. The alliances shifted. What remained was the story of magnificence. This pattern followed Henry everywhere. He often gained image more easily than result. The Battle of the Spurs became a celebrated victory, though its strategic value was limited. Boulogne became a symbol of conquest, though holding it drained the treasury. The royal supremacy solved the annulment, but opened conflicts that lasted generations. Henry was brilliant at making a moment appear decisive. History was less obedient. Blackfriars exposed the limit of performance. Catherine's appearance before the court was political theater too, but it was theater Henry could not control. By kneeling before him and speaking as his loyal wife, she transformed herself from an obstacle into a wronged queen before the watching world. She did not shout. She did not threaten. She appealed to memory. She reminded Henry of shared years, lost children, and the condition in which she had entered the marriage. The legal machinery continued after she left, but the moral image remained. Henry could remove her title. He could separate her from Mary. He could forbid servants to call her queen. He could not force her to believe the marriage had never existed. That resistance mattered because Henry wanted more than compliance. He wanted agreement. He wanted Catherine to validate the story he now told about their life. She refused. The same conflict appeared with Thomas More. More's silence should have protected him if the king required only outward peace. But Henry wanted a public conscience of European fame to approve the supremacy. More would not. The executions of Fisher and More demonstrated that inner conviction had become politically dangerous. The Tower then became the great shadow of Henry's reign. It was palace, fortress, prison, armory, treasury, and site of execution. Royal prisoners could live in comfortable rooms by ordinary standards, attended by servants and allowed books or food. Yet every stone carried uncertainty. Anne Boleyn knew the Tower from her coronation preparations. In 1533, she traveled in triumph through London. Pageants celebrated her. Devices presented her as fertile, virtuous, and chosen. The city was ordered to welcome the new queen. 3 years later, those same claims had become dangerous evidence of how far she had fallen. The crown did not merely execute Anne. It attempted to rewrite her. Her emblems were removed. Her household was broken apart. Her daughter's status was reduced. Official accusations transformed the queen from sacred mother of the heir into adulteress and traitor. But erasure was incomplete. Elizabeth remained alive. Memory remained. Foreign ambassadors preserved reports. Letters survived. And the speed of the proceedings created doubts that never disappeared. Catherine Howard's path to the Tower was different, but carried the same lesson. She had not caused a break with Rome or created a political faction comparable to Anne's. Her danger came from the king's honor and from secrets within the intimate world of the court. The Tudor court offered young women opportunity and exposure at the same time. Service near the queen could bring marriage, patronage, gifts, and status. It also placed behavior under constant observation. Catherine's past, formed in a household with weak supervision and unequal relationships, became fatal only after she married the king. What might have remained gossip in another life became treason at the center of monarchy. The law bent around royal injury. The scaffold made that injury public. Beyond London, the ruins of monasteries told a larger story. Some communities surrendered without resistance. Monks and nuns received pensions, though amounts varied, and women often received less. Some former religious people entered parish life. Others returned to families or lived quietly on small payments. The buildings took longer to disappear. Commissioners inventoried plate, bells, vestments, livestock, grain, books, timber, and lead. Valuable objects moved toward the crown or buyers. Local people sometimes purchased furnishings. Manuscripts were sold, reused, neglected, or destroyed. A book copied by hand over months might become wrapping material. A saint's jeweled shrine might be broken apart for bullion. A guest house that had sheltered travelers might become a private residence. A monastic choir that had sung the offices for centuries might fall silent in a week. Not every monastery had been virtuous. Reform was needed in some places. Critics had complained about wealth, absenteeism, and lax discipline long before Henry's break with Rome. But inspection under Cromwell was not a neutral survey. It served a policy already moving toward seizure. The dissolution therefore combined genuine criticism with financial appetite and political strategy. That combination made it effective. People could support reform for spiritual reasons and profit from it materially. The crown could condemn corruption and sell the property. Nobles could welcome evangelical ideas and enlarge their estates. Motives did not need to be pure to change the world. The pilgrimage of grace revealed how deeply many people rejected the speed and direction of change. The rebels called themselves pilgrims to frame their movement as holy duty rather than ordinary rebellion. They swore oaths, carried religious symbols, and attempted discipline. Their demands varied. Some wanted monasteries restored. Some opposed Cromwell. Some feared taxes or enclosure. Some defended regional influence. Great numbers joined because the movement allowed different grievances to march together. Henry negotiated because he had to. Then he punished because he could. This sequence destroyed trust. The king's promises had encouraged dispersal. Once the movement weakened, later disturbances allowed him to claim the rebels had broken faith first. The legal argument mattered less than the result. The North learned that royal pardon could become a waiting room for execution. Rochester, where Henry met, and of Cleves, revealed another kind of failure, the collision between fantasy and reality. Henry expected and to understand the rules of a courtly game. A disguised lover arrives. The woman recognizes him through noble instinct or responds with delighted grace. The scene confirms romantic destiny, and saw an unfamiliar older man enter and embrace her. She reacted without the performance Henry expected. His embarrassment turned rapidly into dislike. The failed encounter was not simply about appearance. It wounded the king's belief in his own charm. By then, Henry's body had changed, but the court still reflected back the image of the irresistible prince. Anne's confusion broke the mirror. Cromwell paid for it. Hampton Court held many layers of the reign. Wolsey built it as a monument to his ascent. Henry accepted it as a monument to Wolsey's dependence. Jane Seymour gave birth to Edward there and died there. Catherine Howard's household concealed meetings there. Catherine Parr debated religion there. The palace was both home and government. Decisions that changed millions of lives began in rooms heated by fireplaces and lit by candles. A king in pain listened to counselors. A secretary unfolded a paper. A seal was pressed into wax. Messengers rode outward. Then churches changed, prisoners were taken, and armies moved. The distance between private mood and public consequence was frighteningly small. Portsmouth showed the limit of command. Henry could order ships built. He could fund cannon. He could inspect fleets and stand before commanders. But when the Mary rose heeled and water rushed through the gun ports, royal authority could not suspend the laws of wind, weight, and sea. Men trapped beneath decks died within sight of the shore. The wreck is especially powerful because archaeology has recovered traces of individual lives. Longbows, musical instruments, carpentry tools, Cooking equipment, medical objects, shoes, bowls, weapons, and personal possessions emerged from the mud. The great ship was not only the king's symbol. It was a workplace filled with sailors, soldiers, craftsmen, officers, and boys. Royal ambition was carried by ordinary bodies. War records often preserve commanders and treaties. The wreck preserved the people below deck. Whitehall brought the journey to its end. Henry had taken the palace from Wolsey, expanded it, and filled it with images of authority. There he lived within a world designed to satisfy and protect him. But no chamber could protect him from time. We do not know exactly what Henry thought in his final hours. Stories about deathbeds often reflect the hopes of those who tell them. Some wish for repentance. Others imagine defiance. The evidence allows only fragments. He was ill. Cranmer came. A hand was squeezed. The king died. For almost 38 years, Henry's preferences had shaped the movement of an entire court. When he entered, people stood. When he spoke, secretaries recorded. When he frowned, careers trembled. When he desired, ministers searched for law. Then the body that had dominated every room became silent. The council moved immediately because monarchy could not remain empty. Edward had to be proclaimed. Papers had to be secured. Factions had to be contained. The news had to be released at the right moment. The king's death became one final act of government. And once Henry was buried, the struggle to define him began. Protestants could remember the ruler who broke papal power and authorized the English Bible. Catholics could remember the destroyer of monasteries and persecutor of those loyal to Rome. Royalists could praise a strong king who defended sovereignty. Critics could condemn a tyrant ruled by appetite. Later popular culture emphasized the wives, feasts, executions, and enormous body. Victorian historians added moral judgment. Novels, plays, paintings, films, and television turned the Tudor court into an endless stage. Each age created the Henry it needed. The historical king remains harder to hold. He was not born destined to execute queens. He made choices. Those choices were shaped by the world around him, but they were still choices. Other rulers feared succession crises without breaking an entire church. Other husbands suffered dead children without criminalizing a wife's failure. Other kings faced rebellion without treating mercy as a trap. Context explains. It does not erase responsibility. At the same time, calling Henry a monster from childhood explains too little. It makes transformation seem inevitable and prevents us from seeing how institutions, praise, fear, and repeated success can reshape a person. Henry's early charm was real. So was his learning. So was his capacity for friendship. The tragedy is not that these qualities never existed. It is that power allowed him to abandon the limits that might have preserved them. Each time a servant solved an impossible demand, the next demand became easier to make. Each time an opponent was legally destroyed, law became easier to use as a weapon. Each time Parliament confirmed his will appeared more like truth. Each time fear produced silence, silence appeared to be consent. This process did not require the king to wake one morning as a different man. It required only that fewer people could tell him no. That may be the most modern part of his story. Power rarely announces the moment it becomes dangerous. It grows through exceptions. One urgent marriage, one necessary oath, one troublesome minister, one alleged traitor, one temporary seizure of property, one war for honor, one more punishment to restore order. Then, by the time the pattern is visible, the system has learned to obey it. Henry VIII wanted a son to prevent chaos. But after his death, Edward's minority produced faction. Edward's early death produced a succession attempt. Mary's restoration produced religious reversal. Elizabeth's accession produced another settlement. The kingdom passed through decades of uncertainty before the succession stabilized under the Stuarts. The security Henry sought remained beyond reach. What he did secure was memory, not the memory he intended. He wanted to be a new Henry V, conqueror of France. Boulogne did not become another Agincourt. He wanted to be a Christian scholar king. His religious legacy became contradiction and persecution. He wanted a magnificent tomb. It was never completed. He wanted the Tudor line continued through men. His son died at 15. He treated daughters as dynastic disappointments. They became queens. He executed Anne Boleyn and attempted to erase her place. Her daughter created one of the most famous reigns in English history. He destroyed Thomas More's body. More's final stand became more famous than many of Henry's victories. He executed Cromwell as a traitor. The administrative revolution Cromwell designed remained. He closed monasteries to seize their wealth. Their ruins became some of the most haunting monuments of Tudor England. The king controlled lives. He did not control legacy. And so the story returns to the scaffold where it began. Anne Boleyn kneels inside the tower. The sword is hidden for a moment. Witnesses wait. Across the city, bells, boats, markets, kitchens, workshops, and churches continue their ordinary rhythm. Most people cannot see what is happening behind the fortress walls, but the blow will travel far beyond them. It will affect a child named Elizabeth. It will weaken one faction and strengthen another. It will show every future queen the danger of failing a king. It will confirm that royal marriage has become a matter of life and death. It will become the most famous image of a reign already transformed by fear. Henry believed Anne's death cleared the path to stability. 11 days later, he married Jane Seymour. The sun came. The stability did not. That is the final truth of Henry VIII. He possessed more authority than the young prince at Greenwich could have imagined. He bent church, parliament, nobility, marriage, and law around the Tudor crown. He filled palaces with gold, harbors with ships, and the kingdom with his image. Yet the more control he gained, the less secure he became. He changed wives to protect the dynasty. He changed religion to protect the marriage. He changed law to protect his authority. He changed the kingdom so completely that none of his children could rule it without changing it again. The Golden Prince had wanted to become immortal through glory. Instead, he became immortal through consequence. History remembers the crowns, the portraits, the banquets, and the 6 marriages. But beneath them lies a darker inheritance. A king terrified of the future tried to master it. And in doing so, he created a future no one could control.